Montana Territory. Early spring of 1883, the wind carried more than just dust across the plains that morning. It carried the sound of hooves, the scent of pine from the nearby bitterroots, and the sharp crack of a wagon wheel snapping beneath the weight of a life too heavy to bear alone. Sierra Bellamy stood beside the wrecked wagon, hands scraped raw from trying to lift it herself, dark skirts torn near the hem, and two small, wide-eyed children clinging to her sides. She had not cried when the wheel broke. She had not cried when the man she'd paid to take her west turned his horse and rode off, leaving her and her niece and nephew in the middle of nowhere. But she nearly cried when the boy, Holden, only 7, asked if they were going back home now. "There is no home to go back to," Sierra said quietly, brushing his hair out of his eyes. "We're going forward." The girl, Hazel, just 5, reached for her hand. "Where's forward, Aunt Sierra?" She did not have an answer, only a direction. And a letter in her pocket from a cousin she barely remembered, saying she might find work in the town of Alder Bend. It was still miles off, and now the wagon was useless. The wind picked up again, and Sierra turned to shield the children. That was when she saw the rider on the ridge. One man. A tall one, with a tan hat pulled low over his eyes and a rifle slung across his back. He rode slow, careful, like he had seen everything already and was not surprised by much anymore. But when he saw them, truly saw them, he kicked his horse into a gallop. The children stepped behind Sierra as the rider slowed and dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thunk. His eyes flicked to the broken wheel, the scattered crates, the children, and then to Sierra. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and steady. "We will be," Sierra said, lifting her chin. "Wagon's done for. The man I paid ran off." The cowboy looked at her, then at the children, who were now peeking around her skirts. "Name's Jonah Stone," he said. "You got family nearby?" She hesitated. "A cousin in Alder Bend." "If he's still there," Jonah nodded. "That's nearly 20 miles. You will not make it walking. We do not have a choice." His gaze lingered on her face, then he crouched to the children's level. "You too hungry?" Hazel nodded instantly. Holden looked to Sierra for permission. "We have some bread left," she said. "I have jerky, dried apples too," Jonah offered. "You folks can ride with me. I will get you to town." Sierra hesitated. She had learned not to trust quickly. The last man she trusted had taken her money and left her in the dust. Jonah stood slowly. "Look, I do not mean to step where I am not wanted, but you are out here alone with 2 little ones, and that wagon is not going anywhere. Let me help." She studied his eyes. They were the color of the river at dusk, dark but not unkind. "All right," she said finally. "But only into town." He gave a small nod, then turned to unhitch the horses from the ruined wagon. He worked in silence, calm and capable. The children watched him wide-eyed as he lifted Hazel into the saddle and then helped Holden up behind her. When he turned to Sierra, he only extended a hand. She took it and swung up onto the horse behind him. The ride was quiet at first. Sierra kept her hands light on Jonah's waist, trying not to think about how solid he felt under her fingers. The children dozed against each other in front of them. The plains stretched wide around them, golden and endless, the sky a deep blue above. "Where are their parents?" Jonah asked over his shoulder, voice gentle. "Gone," Sierra said. "My sister died last year. Her husband left long before that. I was all they had left." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You took them on yourself. They are not a burden." "I did not say they were." They rode another hour in silence. When they stopped to rest, Jonah handed the children food and water, then sat beside Sierra as the sun began to lower over the hills. "You look like someone who has been told she does not belong," he said, not looking at her. She stared ahead. "I have been told that since I was 16, that I was too plain, too opinionated, that I would never fit in, never be chosen, never be enough. Jonah glanced at her then. That is a damn lie. She looked at him, startled. He added, You do not leave your life behind and cross half the country for 2 children if you are not enough. Her throat tightened. Where do you belong, Jonah Stone? He took a breath, slow and steady. I used to think nowhere. Then I saw you standing beside that wagon. Sierra blinked at him, heart thudding in her chest. You belong here, he said quietly. If no one else has told you that, let me be the first. Hazel giggled then, chasing a butterfly, and the moment passed like a breeze through tall grass. But Sierra could not stop thinking about his words. As evening came, they reached Alder Bend, a small town with a livery, a boarding house, a mercantile, and not much else. Jonah helped them down from the horse and led them to the boarding house himself. I will cover the first few nights, he told her before she could protest. You can pay me back when you are ready. I do not like debt. Then call it a favor, for the children. She looked at him for a long time. Thank you, she said finally. He tipped his hat. I have work at her ranch 2 miles out. I ride in most mornings, if you ever need anything. Sierra nodded. He left then. That night, after the children were asleep, Sierra stood at the window of the small room, watching the moon rise over the hills. For the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. They had told her she belonged somewhere else. But the cowboy, he had told her she belonged here. The next morning broke soft and gray, clouds hanging low over Alder Bend like wet cotton. Sierra woke before the children, her body stiff from days of travel and her mind restless with all the pieces that still didn't fit. She dressed quickly, careful not to wake them, and stepped outside onto the narrow porch of the boarding house. The town moved slowly at that hour. A milk cart rattled past, the driver nodding without a word. A dog loped across the street, nose down, tail twitching. The air smelled of damp earth and chimney smoke. She crossed to the mercantile, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. A bell above the door gave a tired jingle as she entered. A man in his 50s, thin and balding, looked up from behind the counter. You're new, he said without curiosity. I'm looking for work, Sierra replied. And a cousin, Levy Hart, he wrote me last winter. The man scratched his jaw. Levy took off in February, headed for Bozeman, I heard. Left the smithy to a boy who can barely shoe a mule. Her stomach sank, but she only nodded. Thank you, he glanced toward the shelves. Need anything? Not yet. When she stepped back outside, the clouds had begun to break, thin light pushing through. She turned toward the livery, unsure why. Maybe because it was the only place she hadn't checked. Maybe because she knew he'd said he rode into town most mornings. She found Jonah near the corral, a brush in one hand, horse sweat darkening the front of his shirt. He looked up, surprised but not startled. You're early, he said. I needed to know if what you said yesterday was just kindness. He rested his arm over the rail. I don't waste words. She crossed her arms, not out of defiance but to keep from fidgeting. Levy's gone. Took off months ago. Jonah nodded once. That's hard luck. I'll need to find work. And a place that'll take a woman with 2 children. He gave a slow nod, then turned toward the corral. You ever mend fences? I can learn. Cook for a crew? I've fed worse. He raised an eyebrow. What about horses? I've read enough to know which end kicks. That got the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth. He looked back at her, serious again. There's a bunkhouse with a spare room. Not much, but it's dry. You'd have to cook for 5 men and patch whatever needs patching. Not charity, just work. She studied him, then said, the children, ranch is quiet, safer than town. One of the hands has a sister nearby, stops in sometimes. She might help keep an eye when you're busy. Sierra hesitated. Why are you doing this? He set the brush down, his voice even. Because you didn't flinch when everything fell apart. Because you didn't look away when I said I'd seen too much, and because I've watched too many women get told they don't belong." She didn't respond right away. Wind tugged at the loose strands of her hair as she looked past him toward the hills, where the land stretched wide and unpromised. "Fine," she said, "but I'll earn every bit of it." I wouldn't ask it any other way. By midday she'd packed their things, which didn't take long. Jonah returned with a wagon, cleaner and sturdier than the one that had broken. Holden climbed in first, then Hazel, who clutched her doll tight. Sierra sat beside them, her back straight and her eyes steady on the road ahead. The ranch sat in a low hollow near a creek, shielded by cottonwoods just beginning to bud. A broad barn stood at one end, and a two-room bunkhouse leaned slightly westward at the other. The smell of hay and old wood filled the air. One of the ranch hands, a square-jawed man with sunburned cheeks, stepped out of the barn. He raised a hand in greeting. "Miss Bellamy," Jonah said, "this is Travis. He'll show you where everything is." Travis nodded. "You got two little ones. My sister's over tomorrow. She'll bring something for him." Sierra helped the children down. Hazel wandered toward the creek, Holden trailing behind. Sierra watched them go, her shoulders tight. "They'll be safe here," Jonah said beside her. "I don't promise much, but I promise that." She let out a long breath. "I've made promises I couldn't keep. I don't want to be one of those people." He looked at her, not unkindly. "You won't be." Inside the bunkhouse, the room was simple. One bed, a table, a basin. Jonah set their trunk down and stepped back. "I'll let you settle in." She caught his sleeve before he turned. "Will you be around, or is this the sort of offer you make from a distance?" He looked at her hand, then at her. "I ride out at dawn, back by dusk. I'll be around." She let go. "That'll do." He left then, and she watched him walk the path back toward the barn, his gait unhurried, shoulders loose. The children came in muddy and breathless, and Sierra wiped their hands and unpacked the few belongings they had. That night she lit a lamp and sat by the window, Hazel asleep against her side, Holden curled up on the floor nearby. The wind moved through the trees outside, gentle this time, like a hush rather than a warning. She didn't cry. But she did feel something shift, not like arriving, not yet. But like the ground beneath her had finally stopped giving way. By late April, the snowmelt had turned the creek behind the bunkhouse into a ribbon of fast water, cold and clear, its rush constant in the background. Sierra rose before first light most mornings, coaxing the stove to life, and setting dough to rise before the birds stirred. The children had taken to waking with the warmth of bread in the air and the sound of boots on the porch. She'd learned quickly how to stretch meals for 6 grown men, how to mend a canvas flap without tearing it further, how to keep Hazel out of the tack room and Holden from wandering after the ranch dogs. There were small cuts on her fingers now, a permanent ache in her shoulders, and a steadiness in her breath that hadn't been there before. Late one afternoon, after the men had finished branding and the sun was still hanging low over the cottonwoods, Jonah stepped into the bunkhouse kitchen. Sierra was rinsing potatoes, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair braided and tucked beneath a scarf to keep the dust out. "Travis said you stitched up his shirt better than his mother ever did," Jonah said, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe. "He tore it on a fence nail. I told him not to wear it out again until it was patched." "You always speak that straight." She didn't look up. Waste of breath to talk in circles. Jonah crossed to the table where Hazel had left a pinecone collection and picked up one shaped like a small bell. "You ever miss back east?" Sierra set the potatoes aside and wiped her hands on a cloth. "No. No one waiting on word from you. There was no one waiting when I left." He turned the pinecone over in his hand. "Then why head west?" She hesitated, then said, "Because everything behind me was locked in place. Grief does that, turns rooms into tombs. I needed the air to move again. Jonah met her gaze. And is it? Some days, he nodded. I have a sister in Kansas. She married a man who runs cattle. I write her sometimes, though not often enough. She'd like you. I'm not the sort women take to. She would. She respects quiet strength. Sierra looked down at her hands. You didn't strike me as someone with a family. You didn't strike me as someone who'd cross half the country for children not her own. They stood in silence, the room filled with the smell of flour and the sound of creek water through the open window. Sierra turned back to the stove. You should wash up, she said. Supper's nearly on. Jonah paused at the door. You ever need a second pair of hands, anything, just ask. That evening, after the meal was cleared and the bunkhouse quieted, Sierra stepped outside. The sky was pale violet, a sliver of moon rising over the ridge. She walked to the fence line, her shawl wrapped tight, and leaned on the rail. Jonah was by the barn, checking the latch on the grain shed. When he saw her, he walked over, his hat in his hand. Children asleep, Sierra nodded. Hazel asked if the chickens sleep standing up. Travis's hens do. They're too lazy to perch. She smiled without meaning to, the expression brief and unfamiliar on her face. I forget what it's like to laugh without guilt. Jonah leaned his arms on the rail beside her. You carry too much weight on your own. Not by choice. Just by necessity. He looked out over the pasture, where the horses stood still and dark against the grass. You've made this place better since you came. That's not something people say to me. Well, it's true. She studied his profile, the way the light caught the ridge of his cheek and the steady line of his jaw. I don't know what to do with being seen. Sometimes just standing still is enough. Sierra turned her gaze down the fence line, heart slow but loud in her chest. They told me I didn't belong, that I was too sharp, too strange. That what I had to offer wasn't worth keeping. Jonah's voice was soft. They were wrong. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He looked at her, then said, Out here, there's space for things to grow that wouldn't back there. You belong where the roots can go deep. She faced him fully then, lips parted like she might speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she reached out barely and touched his sleeve. He didn't move, just let her. I haven't let anyone stay close in a long time, she said. Jonah's voice was steady. Then let me show you I'm not going anywhere. That night, Sierra lay awake listening to the creek and the soft breathing of the children. Her body was tired, but her chest felt light, unanchored. She had not planned to find steadiness out here. She had only hoped to survive. But where once there had only been silence, now there was something else. A voice that said, You belong here. The wind had shifted with the season. By mid-May, the scent of sagebrush pulled heavier in the afternoons, and the light turned golden earlier, stretching across the valley with a quiet patience that mirrored the pace of things on the ranch. Sierra had taken to walking the pasture fence line late in the day, when her hands were done with the work, and the children were with Clara, the neighbor woman who'd begun helping watch them during the longer stretches of chores. Jonah caught up to her one of those evenings, his shadow falling long beside hers in the dry grass. He didn't speak at first. You always find the edges, he said eventually. They're the first to give way, Sierra answered. And the last to get noticed when they do. He ran a hand along one of the posts. It leaned slightly, the earth beneath it cracked from an absence of rain. You think like someone who's patched too many things alone. She stooped to check the wire, fingers brushing the rust near the staple. I don't think about it. I just do what needs doing, he crouched beside her. That's the kind of thinking that hollows a person out over time. She stood and dusted off her skirt. I don't have the luxury of hollowing. Jonah rose slowly, watching her. You know, I've seen storms flatten a field in minutes, but it's the frost that kills quiet. Sierra tilted her head, curious despite herself. You think I'm frostbitten, not anymore, he paused, but you still brace like it's coming. They walked the rest of the fence without speaking. The sky burned orange above the cottonwoods, and a hawk circled high overhead, its shadow flickering across the grass. When they reached the gate near the creek, Sierra stopped. There was a man once, she said, not looking at him. Back in Pennsylvania. He thought I'd soften with time. I didn't. And when I didn't turn into what he wanted, he left. Jonah leaned on the gate. That's not your burden. It became one. In the eyes of folks who thought I ought to be grateful, he looked twice. You ever think they were wrong? I knew they were. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. I wonder who taught you to measure your worth against silence. Sierra's voice dropped. People don't have to say something out loud for a girl to learn it. Jonah nodded once, slow. No. They don't. The water moved steady in the creek below them, carving its own path as it always did. Sierra looked down at her hands, the small calluses growing at the base of each finger from days spent gripping rope and hammer and kettle. I don't know what I'm becoming out here, she said. Jonah stepped closer, his voice low. You're becoming enough. She met his eyes then, and something in her stilled, not with fear, not with doubt, but with a quiet kind of recognition. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch her. Just stood there, the space between them narrow and warm with something that had taken root slowly, without fanfare. I wouldn't ask you to change, he said. Not for me. Not for anyone. That's the first time someone said that to me without meaning stay small. I mean grow. They lingered there until the light began to fade fully. Then Sierra turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse, her steps unhurried now, the ground beneath her no longer shifting. Inside, Hazel was asleep with her cheek pressed to the top of Holden's shoulder. Clara had left biscuits cooling under a cloth on the table. Sierra pulled the blanket higher over the children and sat beside the window, the one that faced west. She watched the last light bleed from the sky and thought of the way Jonah had stood beside her at the fence line. Not reaching, not pressing, just there. Steady. And for the first time in her life, Sierra didn't feel like something to be endured or corrected. She felt chosen. By early June, the cottonwoods had thickened with green, and the wheatgrass in the southern pasture reached past Sierra's knees. She rose earlier now, not out of necessity but rhythm, her body tuned to the land's quiet demands. The bunkhouse had taken on a lived in stillness. Hazel's carved animals lined the window ledge. Holden's drawings were tucked beneath the basin. The walls no longer echoed. One warm afternoon, Jonah found her behind the barn, splitting kindling with a steady rhythm. He leaned against the tool shed, silent until she noticed him. You always work through the heat, he asked, eyes narrowed against the sun. I like things that show their effort, she said, wiping her brow. He walked toward her, slow. You ever think about making this permanent? She paused, the hatchet held loose in her hand. The work? No, he said. The place. The life. She looked past him toward the pasture where Holden was helping Travis stack feed. I've thought about it. He didn't press, just waited. I used to think I'd have to be someone else to have a life that held, she said finally. But I haven't changed. Not really. I've just stopped apologizing. Jonah stepped closer. I never wanted you to. She set the hatchet down. Her breath came steady, but her voice faltered. I don't know how to be loved without earning it first. You already have, he said. You just didn't notice. She looked up at him, sunlight catching the edge of her jaw. Why me? You never turned away from the hard things. You never made yourself small to be liked. He hesitated. And because I trust you with the quiet parts of me. Sierra exhaled, a long, slow breath. I want to belong somewhere without having to disappear into it. Then stay, he said. Not because you have to, but because you want to. That night, after the children had fallen asleep beneath a quilt stitched from old shirts, Sierra stood at the edge of the porch. Jonah joined her without speaking, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I've spent years waiting for someone to choose me," she said, voice low, "but I think I was asking the wrong question. What would the right one be? Do I feel safe enough to choose someone back?" He looked at her then, and his voice was steady. "Do you?" She reached for his hand. "Yes." The wedding came on a soft Sunday near the close of summer. They stood beneath the cottonwoods, the creek murmuring nearby. Clara made a dress from muslin and lace she'd kept in a chest for years. Travis carved a wooden ring box. Hazel carried a bundle of wildflowers, most of them yellow. Holden stood beside Jonah, tall with pride, his shirt pressed and tucked. There were no grand declarations, just vows spoken plain and clear. Jonah promised her steadiness. Sierra promised him truth. When they kissed, it was quiet and full, as if they'd already walked years into it. They made a home in the small house near the southern boundary of the ranch, where the creek bent close and the wind softened through the cottonwoods. Jonah added a porch. Sierra planted a kitchen garden. Hazel learned to read by candlelight with Sierra's help, and Holden built a birdhouse that hung from the eaves. Evenings came slow and golden. They sat together most nights, Sierra with her hands wrapped around a cup, Jonah beside her with a book he rarely finished reading. They didn't need many words. Their life was built in glances, in shared labor, in the warmth of two people who'd weathered enough alone to know the worth of being together. Years passed. Hazel grew into her voice, Holden into his hands. The ranch held. The house stood. And Jonah never once let go of Sierra's hand when she reached for it. She never had to earn the quiet again. It lived with them, steady as the hills. And she belonged to it wholly, without apology.